Oh, welcome. I am delighted to have some time with one of my favorite people on the planet.
Mhm.
I've been offering what I call conversations with depth practitioners, which could also be called conversations with maniacs. Peter Mellen and I go way, way back, and I've been thinking about how I might introduce him. And I realized that one way to introduce him is through the books that he's written. Um, Way, way back when he wrote a book on the group of seven, which is um, an amazing book, along with the landmarks of Canadian art, which are considered kind of classic books on art in Canada. And then many, many years later, after being a big shot living in Montreal as a professor and critic, he wrote another book called Ultimate Happiness, chasing it, finding it, living it, and a memoir of his life of pursuing what it means to be fully, fully awake. Um, Peter's gone on to become a filmmaker and many, many things in his amazing life, and I'm so grateful to you, Peter, for making the time to have this conversation.
Jonathan, it's always fun to be with you, no matter what we're doing together.
Well, we'll share some of our sordid past together, I imagine, through this talk. You know, one way I'd like to really kind of view this journey is through the lens of the hero's journey. The classic hero's journey is where you feel a calling, and then you kind of refuse the calling, and then you accept the calling, and then your journey is filled with setbacks and obstacles, and eventually, at least according to the whole allegory of the hero's journey, that there's some kind of arriving, and then kind of the return home. Of course, this is the allegory of the Buddha. And you have been on an amazing journey, and I would love to ask you some questions about the calling and some of the adventures that you've had. So to go way way back, you grew up in Montreal, um, in kind of a well-to-do family. What was it like way back then? I don't want to say way back then, but
It is way back then. My God, it's the 50s. Yeah, and the classic WASP Canadian family. Uh, people used to ask my father, "Are you one of the Mellons, i.e., the Pittsburgh Mellons?" And he'd say, "No, we're the Montreal Mellons." Right? Yeah. Uh, But in terms of the calling, Jonathan, when you go back to that era, something happened when I was 12 years old that really I think has impacted, I know has impacted my entire life since then. Um, and actually, the WASP family setting is sort of very important to all this because when I was 12, my mother got sick. No one told me exactly what was happening with her. Remember, in those days, no one mentioned the big C. And then one summer, I was sent off to the country to be with a friend, and I was told I had to go back to the city. And when I got there, I realized, my God, my mother's died. And I went rushing into the living room and threw myself on my father's lap. And I said, "She's gone, isn't she?" And he said, "Yes." And I had this moment of splitting off, of just going out into space. Uh, just like floating free in space. There was no up or down or back or front, just floating in stars. And it felt this was going on forever. And although there was an initial sense of terror with that, there was also this deep sense of peace. And and then suddenly I snapped back to the moment. But I think, that particular event happening sort of stayed with me in some ways, some that knowing. And I think a lot of younger people have different mini kind of awakenings in their life that is sort of the initial calling, if you will, I would say. And maybe they don't come back to that till much later, which certainly was my case too.
So there's the searing loss, and then kind of like the fracturing of your narrative, of your sense of self. And then with that, this kind of, it sounds like it was timeless, sort of just abiding in uh, spacious presence.
Yeah, you could say that. And it was obviously beyond words, beyond thoughts, even beyond feeling in a way. It was just this spaciousness. And I was sort of amazed when that memory popped back much, much later for me. I'd forgotten about it for years and years and years. In fact, I had total amnesia about my past because the whole follow up with my family after my mother's death was just a, a, a very tragic kind of thing. I was really thrown out on my own and just had to, back in those days, one didn't deal with death in any kind of a conscious way. It was just pushed under the carpet.
So
Oh,
there was no conversation around grief,
oh,
no
nothing, nothing,
conversation around
nothing.
loss. It was just,
No one asked me. She was sort of wiped off the planet. So it's like I've spent a lifetime, countless hours of therapy, many therapists, uh, exploring and dealing with it. And I still am, the sense of abandonment and loss. But also, it's what propelled me on the search. Um, and it would be a while, as you said before, before that kind of showed up. I did have one wonderful thing happen a few years later when this wonderful mentor showed up in my life and said, "Hey, Peter, you've got to read this book. It's called Siddhartha." And he said, "Oh, here's another one too. It's Kahil Gibran, the prophet." And yeah, I thought, that's interesting. But then I put him aside and went on achieving and doing. And oh man, I thought I had the world by the balls. I was just
but
on a
so
roll.
so you were, I mean, it just seems like you poured all of your attention into striving and pushing yourself, for, I mean, you've always pushed yourself, but it seemed like a lot of your early life was about pushing yourself to be somebody.
Yeah, to be recognized, to be seen.
You were you were a ski jumper in college, right?
Well, that was pretty close to that sense of being free in space. Let me tell you, that was pretty wild, flying through the air.
Wow.
Yeah, and
So you went to McGill and then you became a professor and you became quite a renowned expert in the art of Canada, right?
yeah, people used to kid me, "Well, you're world famous in Canada," which of course doesn't mean much, but I really thought I had it together, and then I remember being really stressed out at one point. You're going to love this. And somebody said, somebody's teaching a yoga class down the street. And I said, oh, what the hell? I'll go to it. And I went to this class, and this teacher is this little petite German lady with this heavy German accent. Her name, as you know, is Lila Osterman. And and I remember sort of lying on the floor, on this filthy floor. They didn't have yoga mats back then. No one did yoga. And she said, hold these balls, hold your arms out, And I think, oh my God. And I had been totally out of touch with my body. And I felt this sense of peace later on that just was, I said, wow. But at the end of the class, when we did yoga nidra, I thought, oh my God, I want this. And and that was sort of the beginning of the real call, I would say.
So her class got you embodied and present moment, and then in like the yoga nidra, the lying down, just that sense of expansion and release.
Yeah. And of course, my then wife, Fran, was had to make best friends with Leela, and Leela said, "Well, you must learn to meditate." We went off to the country and sat by the the edge of a lake, and she said, "Now sit there for 15 minutes." And I remember sitting, and it seemed like forever. And suddenly there's this blue light in front of my head. I had all these kind of fantasies on what meditation would be and this awakening would be. And I said, wow. And I was almost shaking. I don't think I've ever had such a good meditation since, but it was really fun.
There's nothing like beginner's luck in meditation, and it'll be this way forever.
And this is where you come in, Jonathan, because
Well, so so when I stumbled into the ashram, um, I had just finished my stint in the Peace Corps, and I tried crossing the Sahara Desert on my bicycle and didn't make it, and was sick. And Leela was the she was the yoga teacher, and I'll never forget. Her form of yoga was so interesting. Um, they're really two things. One was she's standing in front of the room and she goes, "We are going to do an exercise which is guaranteed to stimulate digestion and stimulates the entire enteric nervous system. We are going to laugh. Now we will start. Ha 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 ha," which of course led to hysterics. But she was totally serious about it. And then later in another class, she was like, he goes, "I want you to lift your arms and keep the arms over your head." And she goes, "Breathe, breathe." And people started lowering their arms. She goes like, "I said, put your arms up overhead." And I remember thinking like, oh my God, was she from East Germany or West Germany? You know? And it was very, very powerful. But
Yeah,
she was one of the earliest pioneers of yoga, and she woke a lot of people up.
yeah.
And she introduced you to the ashram, and
And
that.
to Amrit, yeah. And
So a little maybe, can you say a little bit about that, because that really formed a total break from your
oh
pretty
yeah.
traditional life.
Yeah, my wife, Franny, and my son, Peter, and I lived up, north of Toronto by a 40-foot waterfall. And we were filmmakers and traveling around the world. And then Leela said, "You must go to see this person, Guru Dev, Yogi Desai." And we went to a seminar. Oh my God, here was this guy sitting on this throne, meditating, and incense and candles and flowers around him. And then he did this session where he made these strange noises, and people started screaming and pounding the floor. 300 people. You know what that's about. And I mean, I was sort of hooked. and and so then Lita said, "You must go to the ashram." And so Franny and I got in a car and drove, what was it, 700 miles or something down to Pennsylvania. And in fact, that's where we met you. Yeah.
And those were such heady, heady days. I
Oh,
remember when I first arrived, and you know, and everyone in the ashram was so nice, and they're saying, "Oh, you're coming to meditation?" I thought, "Oh, well, yeah, I love meditation." And then, sitting at the back of the room, and here's this, long-haired, exotic-looking person, and all the bells and smells, and then he starts this Divine Mother chant, and suddenly, all these people are shaking and barking like dogs and shaking, and I remember thinking to myself, they were so nice during the day. What happened? And then the next meditation, I was shaking and barking along with everyone else. And that his capacity. And for those who are not familiar, Yogi Desai was given Shaktipat Diksha. That is to say that his teacher had given him kind of the power, if you will, to sort of like awaken and enliven energy. in people who are kind of tuned into that frequency. So those early days were just completely, uh, completely amazing. It was just like being microwaved, day and night for months and months and months.
Microwave. Yeah, I must admit I never got the shaking and barking, uh, uh, but I think what's interesting is the whole background to this. That this is like early '80s, beginning in like 1980, and I remember even on the way down there, Franny and I listened to tapes by Ram Dass, where he was talking about meeting his teacher, Neem Karoli Baba, and all this, miracles like bilocation and all this stuff. And I was just, man, I wanted one of these miracles. And it was an amazing time. This is when all these Eastern teachers are coming to the US. I mean, a whole slew of them. And people like Muktananda, he would go down a row with a feathered duster, and people
That's right. His
just kind
peacock
of
feather and transport
peacock
people. And
feather duster, whatever.
but you
But
know what? It's interesting because we I think we had a tremendous amount of romanticism and a tremendous amount of idealism, and there may have been a lot of naivete in that. But when I think about those days, you know, while there may have been a lot of naivete, there was a tremendous amount of sincerity. Yeah, and that's what kind of made it so special, to be around such, sincere seekers.
yeah, and I remember you remember the motto of Palo Ashram back then was love, service, and surrender. And man, the residents, I mean, did they live renunciate lives, and again, the heart energy was so powerful. I mean, wow. Some of the people I met then, like yourself, I'm still friends with. There's really there was a bonding that happened on a very deep level when we all went through that for years, literally.
And there was this blend of definitely heart and sincerity, but also tremendous sacrifice. We had celibacy vows and poverty vows, and we worked 6.5 days a week, and you gave up and you and Fran gave up your whole livelihood and career, to be so immersed in what was happening.
And we all had new names too.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's
Mm.
interesting because Fran and I both had PhDs. We said, well, is this a cult? And we really had a listening for anything inauthentic and around this. And well, came back true and clear. And we haven't mentioned it yet, but Yogi Desai's teacher, Babaji, was living then in the Pennsylvania ashram. And this was a man who had done sadhana like 12 hours a day for years and spent 12 years in silence. I mean, he was the real thing. I don't know what you have to say about that.
Well, what I find so powerful about his life is, how utterly dedicated, he was. Like, he had a hard calling, but he also aligned everything with it. And ultimately, his practice evolved into surrender practice, into what he called prana sadhana, which was basically just the practice of surrendering to life force. And in that practice, he'd set a very clear time limit, and then he was just sort of offered this prayer, and then go into his flow, whatever that was. But one of the most amazing things is that you filmed him doing these in these sessions, and I wonder if you can say a little bit about. Obviously, there's a technical thing of getting the rule of thirds and the lighting and exposure and all that stuff, but you spent hours and hours with this guy who was a truly radiant being. What was that like?
It's true. I mean, was pretty stunning. And there's something that I guess a lot of people don't kind of get. And that's when people have done that kind of deep work and arrived at that place of an extraordinary inner silence, shall we say, that there's kind of a transmission. There's really, it's not like you're sitting in a lecture hall with somebody teaching you or anything. If you went and remember when we would go and we'd all sit on a Sunday morning with Bapaji and he would give what was called darshan. I mean, that was powerful. It was something that very few people, I think, get to experience. And yeah, filming him, I think I was just kind of innocent enough that I think if I'd been really susceptible, I probably would have been on the floor flailing around. But I just did my job,
Well,
and
so many people when with him in person would fall asleep,
yeah,
because it would just sort of, you just sort of, they would just sort of trance out around him.
yeah,
So
it's
keeping your eye on the exposure and focus, probably helped you
yeah,
to monitor yourself a little bit.
yeah. I mean, and this Babaji was in India, had thousands and thousands of followers. I mean, he was uh, serious stuff, and boy, I think we all, anyone who was there in those days and experienced being in his presence, really probably have never forgotten that.
So you and Fran did a beautiful film called The Path of Love, which is really extraordinary. Is that out there? Is that available at
I think
all?
you
Or
can find it. Yeah, I have no idea
is it
where.
on YouTube or anything like
Yeah,
that? Or
possibly. Yeah, it's a half-hour film.
it's so good. And if I can find it, I'll put the information in the
Yeah,
show notes.
yeah, that was an extraordinary time because Fanny and I kept commuting back up to the waterfall and filming and going back and editing. And then we just, I mean, we fell so in love with the whole community and just watching him on an editing screen, 8 or 10 hours a day. I was really hooked, and we said, let's move down to the US. So we pulled up our everything and just moved with my son down to Pennsylvania to this little
So
ashram.
so then there's the call, and then responding to the call,
Mm.
and then there are the heady days, just like, that first meditation that just, is so juicy, and then like the heady days of kind of arriving in the, in the ashram. And then of course there's the setup for, the belly of the whale,
Exactly.
for the obstacles, the churning and burning. And I wonder, because I think you lived in the ashram for like 10 years, right?
Yeah, basically, we're very, I mean, 100% committed for a long 10-year period of time.
So can you say a little bit about the churning urn of burning funk that is an inevitable part of any
Well,
practice?
it's fascinating because as with, it's like it had an arc, and we soared for years through the sky like a comet, and those were the days where we moved from this tiny little community down in Pennsylvania, and we, as you recall, we went up to this huge Jesuit, transformed this Jesuit seminary up in Lenox, Massachusetts, this huge, what is it, 5-acre building into a yoga and health center. And in no time, we had like 350 people on staff and thousands of people coming every year for programs, which many of which you led, Jonathan. You were really instrumental in all of this. You've got to take the blame here too.
Well, plus, I mean, you and I were side by side raising a lot of money for the place too.
That's embarrassing. Yeah, we
I know a little bit. I
in
feel a little bit
development.
like like Goebbels sometimes, but
We had so much fun though. I can't believe it.
no, it was a
And one
blast.
day we remember we did a skit in front of the other residents where we put on raincoats and pretended to be out raising canvassing someone for money. Anyway, we had a lot of fun.
And wasn't there didn't in to the tune of a thousand miles, we did a song, $1,000, I think. We were
I don't remember
asking
the
everyone for money when they walked in the door.
I know. But
So
we did it
what
very, I thought it was very cool the way we handled all of that. It was very heartfelt and
Well, again, it was back to sincerity, because
yeah,
we both deeply believed in what was happening
yeah,
because so many people were transforming through this. But at the same time, you know, something began to shift.
yeah.
Can you say a little bit about what began, what did you begin to sense and feel
Oh,
in the community?
well, it's amazing. Again, it's like the arc of the comet. Something it starts burning up. And I just started, I went away for a while. I know it was the time when my wife Franny discovered that she had stage 4 breast cancer, and we moved suddenly to Maui, to Hawaii. Actually, it was to Kauai. And she said, if I've got a year to live, I want to live where I can put my feet in the ocean every day. So I was away for a period of time. She died a few years later, and that's a whole other whew, belly of the whale story. Um, but then I came back. Uh, a lot happened here with my new partner, Linda, to live at Grapalu. And I noticed what a change. Everybody seemed to be kind of doing, instead of uh, getting to a point of no ego, they were getting to a point of having bigger and bigger egos of, they were the head of this and the director of that, and Amrit was beginning to not collect Rolls Royces, but he was beginning to build his big sort of house on the hill. It was like there's like a sense of complacency, everybody doing their job, and I know you were probably sensing that too, but it was somehow it was like a car about to go over the cliff and you couldn't
Y-
stop it.
It's sort of like we all took on selfless service, and then we got really successful.
Yeah.
And we became successful selves. And part of it was, I used to say like, like, oh my God, I think I live in an upper middle class ashram, you know?
Exactly.
And, and people started to they became known and they became popular and became celebrities, out of the whole experience. And then there was more, sort of a more like a comparing and, um, yeah, it really became, instead of dropping our egos, we really, really kind of picked them up. And then,
Yeah,
of course, the whole thing collapsed.
it certainly did. And that was that is, I think I remember I was living in Taos, New Mexico, when I heard about the collapse. And I said, my God, this is the best thing that ever could have happened. I know it's painful, and these poor guys are just going through the burn, but wow. Um, I know you went through that big time.
Yeah, that was it was a massive shift. I mean, it was a massive breakdown of this model. And, in many ways, um, I mean, we could do a whole thing on that. And, gosh, I'm aware of the time. And
I don't know how long we will
I
go.
just want to say, like, well, we'll just have to bracket that, like,
Yeah.
the collapse of the ashram. But what really strikes me, Peter, and we have like 15 minutes, um, like, it seems to me that so much of your early life which was like this path of self-improvement, really being someone. Um, it's like you became more obsessed with, like, instead of self-improvement, like eliminating the self. So at that time, you really turned toward other teachings and other traditions that were really, really powerful for you. And I know that's what fascinates me, is sort of like that sense of striving, um, and then like the striving around not striving.
You got it. Yeah. Yeah. I wish I'd called my book Chasing Enlightenment, because it was like, as much as I was achieving in terms of like in the real world out there earlier, and now I was wanting to achieve enlightenment, which of course is a total contradiction in terms. And my uh, second wife, Linda, was something of a mystic. And we were living on Kauai, and someone invited us to dinner. And during the dinner, she had just gotten back from India, where she had met a teacher named Papaji. And she said, I've got this present for you. And she handed us this book, and it had the picture of someone on the cover. And I saw that it was Ramana Maharshi, who is, was one of the great saints of the 20th century in India, of all the centuries in India or anywhere. He died in 1950. But I looked at this photograph of him, and there was this peace that was emanating just from a photograph. I said, man, I really want that. And wow, this guy, uh, this is something I've got to look into. And Linda, too, just went head over heels for him. And we just devoured everything we could find on Ramana Maharshi. And then that led us to looking into one of Ramana Maharshi's. Ramana Maharshi didn't have disciples. For him, there was no other. He didn't see himself as an awakened in the, I mean, not in the slightest. He lived at the foot of this mountain for 50 years without moving away from it, and deep sadhana. And he said, my only teaching is silence. And so it's not like there's any kind of attempt on his part to people just came to sit in his presence in silence. But one person who came was named Punjaji, or later called Papaji, and he went back to his town of Lucknow, India, and started talking about these teachings. And he sort of, should we say, woke up, and people started flooding to see him from all over the world. Someone said all you had to do was fly over Lucknow and you could get awakened. And then they all came back to the United States, many of them, like Gangaji and so many others, with this teaching and this kind of lineage of Ramana Maharshi to Papaji to whoever. And so I got very caught up with all of that. And it was 10 years of going to retreats. And oh my God, I remember I took you, Jonathan, to an evening with Gangaji in Santa Fe. I don't know if you want to talk about that.
I remember visiting you, and we went to a junior high school where she was giving darshan, I guess, and previously, in the ashram, I was kind of the warm-up act for Yogi Desai on the road. So, there was a fellow there who was there to kind of like greet everyone and told a couple of jokes and got everyone comfortable and talked about the protocol. And I just sat there going like, that was me. And then she walked in and everyone stood and had their hands in front of their heart. And I was having a panic
Oh,
attack.
you were in the back.
Exactly. Exactly. Not this again. But what's so paradoxical, is, what would you say was sort of like the essence of the message of that lineage from Ramana Maharshi through Papaji and Gangaji and these other teachers.
Oh my, yeah. I remember asking Gangaji a question. I said, uh, Gangaji, for the last 10 years, I've been practicing yoga and meditation. And I was told if I practice, I'll eventually get awakened. It may take even lifetimes, but I'll get there. And she said, you can practice and practice, but it's not going to get you through the gate. No one gets through the gate. And I remember that had a huge impact on me.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in those teachings, there's this whole sense of no self, of we're already one, we're already self, consciousness, all that is. There's nowhere to get to, there's nowhere to go. And I remember saying, oh my God, I can relax, let somebody else drive the bus. And it was huge for me, that shift to realizing, oh, okay, just be still, be quiet, uh, and that's really been for years now the inner kind of message I give myself. And
So a real shift from doing and becoming to that settling back into presence.
yeah, and I just do want to say that someone who's not connected with any of these people, Adyashanti is one of the, I think, the most kind of pure spirits there, of someone who somehow has arrived at this, and he got there through very intense Zen meditation. But again, it's not like you stop meditating, but the thought that meditating is going to bring you somewhere is dropped. And I don't know, I've had these glimpses, but it's like a falling backward into what's already there, the no self.
One of the lines from Adya that has always touched me is this piece around how no one ever achieved awakening through adding anything.
Mm,
It's through the falling away.
yeah,
And it is such a profound paradox, isn't it?
isn't it? Yeah. And I remember I had this experience of living in the country, down where I had the farm, and I was riding my bicycle, and I had my two dogs running beside me, and I got sort of mesmerized by the sound of the bicycle wheels on the dirt road and the dogs clump, clump, clump. Suddenly, I was back behind my body, looking down on this person who had on jeans and a shirt and was riding a bicycle, and just sort of kind of watching this, and it was so peaceful. It was I'm not those thoughts, those feelings, that identity. The truth of who I am is somehow watching all of this. So if these little glimpses come, but I certainly am not abiding in that state all the time, I can tell you.
But I just know, and again, it kind of comes back to that. I kind of come back to that in that 12-year-old, on your father's lap, who in the midst of that absolute shocking grief, like sort of falls into this like kind of ecstatic presence, like
Mm,
that has, set up such a sincere drive in you, you know, through your life. And it seems like it's moving more and more into kind of a surrendered, a practice of sort of surrendering to your life. And I know you've just moved to the DC area, and I would imagine moving from Maui to DC was, I would imagine, another form of surrender. And where do you see your practice? How do you see your practice now? How do you hold the unfolding now?
oh, Jonathan, what a, what a question. This has certainly brought me to my knees. I mean, there's a whole story there of eventually my wife Linda died, and then I met someone else, and we were together 10 years, and I knew I had to leave that relationship. And as you can imagine, it took quite a bit to have me step out of that relationship and move 5,000 miles and leave Hawaii and my dog and my community. But here I am, but it's sort of brought me to my knees, and I just am surrendering moment by moment. Not easy, and I must say that insight meditation, and I know when I got here, I saw your talk on starting life over, and that really, really touched me. That was an extraordinary talk. And I remember you talked about the trapeze artist swinging through the air, and he lets go of the trapeze, and yet he's midair and hasn't grabbed the next one. I'm sort of in that midair space right now. And it's scary and exciting. And I'm thrilled because I've somehow, through insight meditation and you and Tara and what you both offer, and the Center for Mindful Living based here in DC, I'm sort of discovering a kind of an anchor and a new way of moving through this with awareness. And I've still got a long ways to go. The journey ain't over, baby. I can tell you.
You know, it's sort of like what I find so interesting is, when you think of like life evolving like a movie, and you could easily think, okay, you're here's the end of the story. You're on Maui and
Yeah.
moving into um, into the final exit, and you
The
realize, oh my
twilight.
God, yes, again, and you realize, my God, there's another act, there's a whole other act,
It's a big one. It's even
and now
more
and
intense
here
than any
you
of the
are.
others.
And
Yeah.
again, it comes back to kind of the essence of just sensing what's here and how to hold it. And
Yeah. Yeah.
it's such deep admiration and love for you, and just
Oh,
the courage of how you have always lived your life, and how you're living it now.
well, thank you, Jonathan. And you've been a big part of that. And just you and Tara have been such an inspiration for me. I mean, my goodness. And so it goes. I mean, um, we take the next breath, we take the next step, and what I'm discovering is something shows up. I mean, okay, next step, put my running shoes on, go for a walk, and oh, there, talk to that person or say hi or smile. And it's just trusting. And I don't know where it's all going to go. I'm living alone for the first time in 50 years of intimate relationship.
Mm.
And it's a little bit of an adjustment.
Wow. Wow. The practice continues.
Doesn't it? And just when we think we're arriving at the destination, woo.
Mm. Well, I know that there's that element of trust. And I also know that, at least from I find real comfort in, that whole beautiful teaching around like verified trust.
Mm,
Like even though we're letting go of the trapeze bar and we don't know if there's a net, we're on something in us remembers we've let go before and it's been okay. And just a deep bow to you for living your practice so fully from the inside out.
mm. Yeah, thank you, Jonathan.
Well, I for one am grateful you're in the DC area.
You too.
Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you so much for your time. I'm so grateful to be able to share some of this practice and just to kind of love the mystery of it all.
Yeah, and fun to reminisce about
Yeah.
the old days together.
Oh my God. Oh
40
my.
years we've of knowing each other.
I know. It's crazy. It's crazy. Well, thank you again.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Yeah.
Take care.